A Spy Called James, the true story of James Lafayette, Revolutionary War double agent. Written by Anne Rockwell, illustrated by Floyd Cooper. On October 19, 1781, the Battle of Yorktown ended with an American victory over British forces. Thanks to the help of French troops, including General Lafayette, the colonists were now poised to win the war they'd been fighting against the British since 1775. With the war's end, America would be a free country. One of the last things British General Cornwallis did before returning to England was to visit Lafayette's camp. Cornwallis wondered how his army of redcoats had been beaten by the young French general. The two generals had at least a couple of things in common. Both came from impressive families and both had impressive names. Cornwallis' full name was Charles Cornwallis, first Marquis, and second Earl Cornwallis, Viscount Brougham, Baron Cornwallis of Ayr. Of I. The Frenchman's full name was Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert de Moutier, Marquis de Lafayette. In France, his friends called him Gilbert, but in America, he was simply Lafayette. It's easy to imagine that the American Revolution and the fate of the 13 colonies were in the hands of men like these, men whose names were destined to be famous: Franklin, Jefferson, Washington. After all, not long after the war ended, streets, schools, parks, and cities would be named after these men. A list of names had also helped start the year war. Many of these famous men signed the Declaration of Independence, telling the King George of England the colonies would be free. But America would not have won independence without the courage of thousands of people whose names never became famous. Cornwallis saw one such a man in Lafayette's camp during his visit. He must have known in a flash exactly how Lafayette had defeated him. The person saw was known by one name, but without him, the war might have ended very differently. His name was James, and he was enslaved by a Virginia tobacco farmer named William Armistead. James heard that an enslaved man could be granted his freedom by fighting for the colonies. James was interested, and in 1781, Armistead allowed him to join Lafayette to help defeat the British. James was sent to serve under the French general with names to spare. Soon after, James was ordered to spy on the most infamous man name in American history, Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold began the Revolutionary War on the side of the colonists. He fought bravely in many battles, but Arnold did not feel appreciated. After being passed over for promotion in 1779, Arnold secretly switched sides. By the next year, he was spying for the British, working against his own commander, General George Washington. Arnold's efforts to aid the British failed, and he was revealed as a spy. He fled to the British Army in late 1780s before American troops could catch him. Soon, Arnold was fighting again, this time alongside Cornwallis in battles against the American army. And this is where the infamous spy crossed paths with the spy nobody knew. On orders from Lafayette, James dressed in tatters and presented himself as a runaway slave to Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold. He offered to guide British soldiers along the unfamiliar roads. He foraged for food for the troops. The soldiers accepted his help, but no one paid much attention to him. This was a big mistake. Cornwallis, Arnold, and the troops said things in front of James they shouldn't have. James saw a secret plans and maps, and then he snuck away and passed on what he heard to Lafayette. The British had such faith in James that they asked him to spy on the American for them. James agreed, carried information to Lafayette from the British, and gave the British misleading information about American plans. Working as a double agent was incredibly risky. If the British discovered James was a spy, they would do what they did to all spies: hang him immediately. And if American soldiers who didn't know who he was caught him carrying papers to the British, They too might execute James as a spy. But James was never caught. Within a year, the information he passed to Lafayette allowed the colonial army to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. The British army had no choice but to surrender. James was in Lafayette's cap when Cornwallis paid his visit. No one knew for sure if James saw the look on Cornwallis's face when the general realized who had fooled him, but it's not hard to imagine James would have felt satisfied. The war officially ended in 1783 with American victory, but there was no victory for James. While received credit for his spying during the war, these activities didn't earn James the freedom he expected. Such freedom was reserved for black soldiers in the American army, not spies. 3 years later, after fighting ceased, James was still enslaved. When Lafayette learned about James's circumstances, he was outraged. He gave James a certificate written in Lafayette's own hand, declaring he would be free. This is to certify that the bearer by the name of James has done essential services to me while I had the honor to command in this state. His intelligence from the enemy's camp were industriously collected and most faithfully delivered. He properly acquitted himself with the some important commissions I gave him and appears to me entitled to every reward his situation can admit of. Done under my hand, Richmond, November 21st, 1784, Lafayette. 2 years later, the Virginia legislature made James a free man. In tribute to what Lafayette did for him, he took the last name Lafayette. James Lafayette was finally free.